Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the World IA Cafe Speaker Series. Thank you for joining in today. We have had so many wonderful speakers in this speaker series. I hope you have enjoyed all these webinars, and I'm sure today's webinar would be wonderful as well. My name is Rupa Mishra. I'm an associate professor at Rutgers University. I manage and teach in the user experience design and product design concentrations in the MBS program. I'm also an active member of World IA Association. The topic for today's webinar is functional instead of flawless. I love it already. The speaker for this interactive event is Jael Schultz. Jael has been working in digital strategy for over a decade, specializing in content strategy and information architecture. Currently, she works as a content architect at American Express. Her education is in design, which gives her a unique lens on visual problem solving, which is so important in today's world. And she enjoys messy information problems, mapping concepts as visual, and creating order from chaos. Love it. Beautiful. Let me share her LinkedIn profile link in the chat. I can find the chat. Yeah, okay. Okay. Also, I would like to let you know that we'll be recording all the speakers, which we have done so far in this World IA Cafe's speaker series, and the videos will be available on World IA's website. Let me share the website link in the chat. Okay. It's a great organization to network and meet people from all over the world. This is something I've been saying for all these webinars. If you're interested, then please do join the organization. It is wonderful. Every year we host World IA Day, and this has been going on since 2012. The format of the Cafe Speaker Series is this: about 45 to 50 minutes would be the talk, followed by around about 10 minutes Q&A. So please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask your questions. I would also like to remind you this is an excellent opportunity to network with one another. So if you would like to share your LinkedIn profile link, then please do so in the chat. Let me put mine. Okay. Let me also put my department's website link if anyone is interested in our master's programs, user experience design or product design. Enjoyed the webinar today, and now over to you, Jael.
Awesome. Thank you for the warm welcome, and also to obviously the World Information Architecture Association and Rutgers for hosting and for inviting me to speak. Rupa did a great job introducing the topic, so I'll jump into the table of contents and then we can get started on what we're going to be discussing tonight. We'll do a little bit of an intro to myself, which Rupa's already done a great job covering, so we'll keep that brief. And then to the topic, what does it mean when I'm saying flawless? We'll talk about the problem with perfect. Sounds like a good thing, but it can lead us to some pitfalls, some myths of perfection, and then we'll get into how we could be less perfect and how that could potentially be a good thing, meaning ways we might apply this to our work, to our collaboration, and so forth. And then, as mentioned, we'll save a little bit of time at the end so we can get into Q&A and hopefully have some discussion there. I do want to make a note, and this illustrates a little bit the point of the talk, that the title is functional instead of flawless, and then I ended up using perfect for all of these session titles because there's so many good alliterations available. But instead of continuing to dither over the exact way to label the talk, I went ahead and got my description in so that we could move forward with it. So it just sort of illustrates the idea of going ahead with something instead of waiting for it to be exactly right. So by way of introduction, I will keep it brief about myself since Rupa already walked you through all of that, but I do have a fun fact that I would like to add. I'm good at untangling knots, and I mean literal physical knots, in addition to the metaphorical ones that I handle in work. I do have a background in design, as was mentioned, but content strategy is something I fell in love with, and I feel like it plays to my strengths, so I've kept doing it. And I'm currently working at American Express as a content architect on our communications design team. So a little bit about the topic itself. What do I mean when I say flawless? I think that all of us, whether we are information architects or designers in any way, shape, or form, that it is our job to solve things. And that's something can be layered and complex. So we're looking at complex problems and systems that we're trying to distill down into understandable solution. A lot of times we're working with a huge variety of stakeholders. All of them have different kinds of input and different kind of outcomes that they're looking to accomplish, which can make it very difficult to handle sort of all of the needs that we have to work with there. We're also advocating tirelessly for our users and our customers. Sometimes those partners that we're working with don't exactly understand how the business outputs they're looking to drive align with the sort of customer outputs that we're advocating for. And I could go on for a while. As we're working on these complex, nuanced projects and design and information problems, trying to make things better, easier, more effective, it's easy to become laser focused on finding the quote unquote right solution. We're looking for this perfect panacea for all things digital. And I'm hoping that I haven't sent everybody into flashbacks of a particularly difficult project or a particularly difficult stakeholder that they've worked with. But this is the environment that we live in within our disciplines. And it's important to remember why we're here and why we're doing this work. We want to do things well. We're looking for the right answers, the right solutions, because our jobs are important and we care about them. I'll add a caveat that probably most of us are a little bit of perfectionists by nature. Most people that I've known in design and content fields are just a little bit. And this sounds like a good thing. It should be a good thing. But I think that when we're on the hunt for these sort of really perfect or flawless solutions for these difficult problems, it can lead us down the wrong path or stall us out in certain ways. So let's talk a little bit about the potential problems with pursuing perfection. And I am going to keep alliterating through the whole talk, and I won't apologize for it because it's fun. The problem with perfect is that when we're searching for a flawless solution to something, we can lose our way, like I said. I'm going to list out a few points here, and it's not an exhaustive list, but these are a few of the problems that I have seen come up time and time again on projects or struggled with myself. And there are many others as well. If you think of another one, feel free to drop it in the chat, because I always love hearing directly from folks some of the stuff that they're dealing and struggling with as well. We can run into analysis paralysis. So we're weighing multiple potential solutions against each other, trying to figure out which one is the exactly right solution that we could go ahead with. We might have stakeholder conundrums. So we have stakeholders from all different disciplines, all different leadership levels, and we're trying to persuade all of them which direction we need to move in before we can go forward. And we're being pulled in a million different directions because we're getting input from all of these folks. There's the never-ending project. I've seen this one happen so many times, particularly working when I worked in higher ed or currently working in finance, because there are so many variables out there and we're trying to find a solution that addresses all of them. The project ends up spinning on and on because somebody keeps coming back with a new variable that wasn't accounted for, and the scope of the project keeps growing and growing and growing, and it never gets out the door. Bias confirmation is another one that we would need to be aware of. So if we're hunting for a quote unquote right answer on something, then we're assuming that we hold the truth, that we're the arbiters of what is or is not the right thing. And we might rely too much on our past experience. Our past experience can guide us. That's really important as professionals that specialize in a discipline, but there is always the potential for it guiding us in the wrong direction, making too many assumptions, and then going ahead and confirming that. Andrew asks, what about a higher ed finance app? That sounds like a very interesting and very complex problem to solve. I'll have to put that in my back pocket. Thanks, Andrew. So we've talked about a couple of potential problems with searching for a flawless solution. And to dive a little bit deeper into this idea, I want to talk about a few myths of perfection. There's just 3 myths that I'm going to cover here. I think they distill down some of the elements that I've seen as pitfalls. Maybe you have some other myths that you've encountered and you want to share them with the rest of the group. If so, please feel free to do that. But we're going to cover at least 3 that I've seen come up time and time again. The first myth is that a perfect solution exists. The fact of the matter is there may be bad solutions and there may be better solutions, but there's rarely ever a single correct solution. And if you think there is one and you're hunting for it, you're going to tie yourself into knots trying to narrow down a set of good possible solutions to the single perfect one. This one that you think is going to solve all of the problems of the project, make all your stakeholders happy. It's going to give you a perfect case study that lands you your dream job while you're at it. It's a lot to put into it. So the first myth is thinking there is a single perfect solution out there, and I can narrow it down to that. Myth number 2 is it's up to me to find that perfect solution. So if you assume that a flawless solution to a problem or a project exists and you're out there hunting it, then you're assuming it's up to you to find the solution. The fact is, for better or for worse, our work never happens in a vacuum. So if you're assuming all the responsibility for hunting for this mythical perfect solution, you're assuming too much. We can see a negative side to this idea that our work never happens in a vacuum, where we might think that if we have constraints with stakeholders, with budgets, with technology, there's no way for us to just wave a wand and wish those factors outside of yourself didn't exist. So you would never be able to overcome those just on your own and find the perfect solution. But I think it's important to also flip this and see the positive side of it as well. All of the work that we do, whether in information architecture, design, etc., is by necessity informed and shaped by the existing systems, technology, and the people that interact with them, whether the people inside a company, our partners, or the customers. So you can't create solutions in a vacuum, and you definitely can't create the perfect solution in a vacuum if that even existed. Myth number 3. Myth number 3 is that the perfect solution will solve the problem. A solution should solve something, obviously, but when we're hunting for perfect solutions, it's easy to get locked into a static mindset. So we're assuming that once we've solved this problem or set of problems, we're going to create a perfect state of the system, and the system is then going to remain in that perfect state. The fact of the matter is, digital is a living, breathing thing. It can't be perfect. You can't contain it. It's never going to be a snapshot in time forever, but it can be functional and flexible. Jerry McGovern in his book Transform, which I highly recommend if you work in digital and with other people, which most of us do, or will be doing in the future, has this quote: "Digital is the never-ending experiment. The longer you keep it inside the silo, the less chance it has of success. Connect it up, let it loose, get it out into the customer ecosystem, and evolve it based on use. Don't build to last, build to change." And I think that's a great encapsulation of this idea that the longer we spend locked in a situation, hunting for the right solution or the perfect solution, the more digital is running away from us. I love what the comment in the chat, because we're about to get to that in just a minute. It's a great quote. So we've talked about 3 myths of perfection, and how the idea of perfection, or that a single flawless solution might exist and we could find it, can be a problem. Let's talk a little bit about how we can be less than perfect. Okay, so I've given everybody an existential crisis about your career, about the field you're studying, whatever it might be, saying, we try too hard and we can't be perfect. I want to remind us that just because we can't be perfect doesn't mean we can't do well. We can do better. Better for yourself, better for your projects, better for your partners. And we'll look at what that means. The very first thing that I want to say about how to be less than perfect is don't give up. I think it's important to acknowledge that the work that we do can be really challenging. It can be exhausting at times. And you're all here on this cafe with me, spending your hard-earned leisure time or lunch hour, listening to me tell you that you should be doing less. That doesn't mean that you should give up now. And this was previewed in the chat, which I think is awesome. You may be familiar with the saying, quote, "All models are wrong, some are useful," attributed to statistician George E.P. Box. And I think this quote is a brilliant distillation of the conundrum we face when we're creating solutions. It certainly applies to what we're discussing this evening. We're not going to be able to find a correct model or a perfect solution. Doesn't mean that we can't find useful or functional solutions. But there is a quote of his that I like a little bit better for this discussion, which I'll show next. From his 1976 paper on science and statistics, he says this about the topic of worrying selectively. Quote, "Since all models are wrong, the scientist must be alert to what is importantly wrong. It's inappropriate to be concerned about mice when there are tigers abroad," end quote, emphasis added. So when we pivot away from the search for perfection or for flawless solutions, we're not giving up. We're focusing our efforts where they matter most, on the tigers instead of the mice. We're making sure that we're wrong in the ways that aren't critical. So if we're going to make this pivot about how we're approaching problems and solutions, then how do we build functional models, architectures, systems, designs, etc., instead of flawless ones? I think the first thing that we'll have to do is embrace a new philosophy on our work. And then I'll also talk through a bit of the practical applications that this new philosophy might have and what that could look like if we're applying it to our work. All right, so let's talk about the new philosophy. If we're not giving up, but we're abandoning the search for flawlessness, we're going to have to embrace a new philosophy. And this is one that you might find useful in real life as well. I have. And it's that if perfection isn't possible, you can ditch those expectations that you had for yourself or that other people had for you and focus on what's importantly wrong. And I would like to sum it up like this. If you're wrong, you're free. That might sound a little bit wild, but it's true. If you're already wrong, you're free. There's an essay by Martin Schwartz called The Importance of Stupidity in Scientific Research, which I'm sure you can tell by the title is a fantastic read. I really love it. It's something that I revisit from time to time, and I've linked it in the resources document that I'll drop in the chat at the end if you want a chance to read through the whole thing. It was originally published in the Journal of Cell Science, but I think it's really applicable to the type of work that we do, and I want to share just a couple of excerpts from it. Quote, "The crucial lesson was that the scope of things I didn't know wasn't merely vast. It was, for all practical purposes, infinite. That realization, instead of being discouraging, was liberating. If our ignorance is infinite, the only possible course of action is to muddle through as best we can." I love this concept, and I think it's applicable beyond the work that we do. It's applicable to life outside of work as well. I've definitely found it therapeutic on occasions when I've had to muddle through as best I can. And there's one more excerpt that I want to share from Mr. Schwartz. He says, "If we don't feel stupid, it means we're not really trying. Productive stupidity means being ignorant by choice. Focusing on important questions puts us in the awkward position of being ignorant. The more comfortable we become with being stupid, the deeper we'll wade into the unknown, and the more likely we are to make big discoveries." So if I were to summarize what this means for us in terms of our new philosophy, I would say that when we're ready and willing to focus on the important questions and be productively stupid, we're then also embracing an attitude of humility. And I want to put a caveat in this one and say there are definitely times and places where it's important to have the opposite of a humble attitude. So I'm not saying that you have to get trampled over by anybody with an agenda and a louder mouth, but when to not be humble is an entire topic, an entire worthwhile topic in and of itself. So I'll leave that for now. And I'll say, in terms of being ready to focus on the right questions and abandon the search for perfection, this can be the right place. We're giving up on the preconceptions that we have, and the idea that we should be able to discover the exactly right answers. We're freeing ourselves to be humble in the right kind of ways, the ways where we don't have to feel ashamed by being productively stupid or not having all the right answers all on our own. It also lets us check our biases or preconceptions. If we're assuming that we know nothing and that we're already wrong, then we need to ask, explore, and confirm before we take anything to be true. Okay. We've got a new philosophy. We're ready to be wrong or productively stupid. I think the next question is, what does that mean practically in how we do our work? Like Martin Schwartz says, the more comfortable we are being stupid, the deeper we'll wade into the unknown. And that puts us in a place to approach our work and our partnerships in a different light. I think there are a lot of different ways to touch this. I think it opens up the door for more curiosity, collaboration, and potentially innovation. If we're wading in really deep and we're asking those stupid questions, it puts us in a place for new discoveries. But I want to touch on kind of 3 areas or 3 phases of projects where I found this to be most applicable. And if you think of other places, other ways where you could see this making sense, again, drop it in the chat. I'd love to hear about it. The first area is in discovery. So in the initial phase of a project or the initial phase of defining a problem, we can ask every question. And if we're going to frame this in terms of productive stupidity, I think instead of saying the typical thing, which is there are no stupid questions. I think we should say the stupider the question is, the better. And you can quote me on that. We can also examine our assumptions and the assumptions of others, which I've mentioned before. But if we're assuming we don't know anything, we can ask ourselves, our stakeholders, our partners, why do we believe this thing is true? Why do we believe this is going to work or this other thing is not going to work? We can also define success in unconventional ways. So if we don't have to stick to the formulas that we're used to, we can ask stupid questions that get to the heart of what matters. We might be able to explore different parameters for what success might mean. These are some of the things that we could think about as we're going through that sort of discovery or initial phase of a project. When it comes to collaboration, I think there are a few really useful applications here. We can share earlier and more widely. If we want to affect real change, whether within an organization or within a digital system, our first customers are actually our partners, for better or for worse. And if we're less concerned about this paradigm that we sometimes lock ourselves in, where we feel like we have to come up with all the right answers and a flawless solution in and of ourselves while working in a vacuum, instead, we can share what we're working on before it's polished, before it's finished. We can share it earlier so that we can get feedback, so that we can test out our assumptions, so we can find out where we're importantly wrong. That also lets us invite input without fear. Specifically the kind of fear that comes from worrying about looking less than perfect and not having every answer. And this is something that I don't think that we should be judgmental of ourselves about, because it's a very human instinct, probably not something that you'll ever set yourself free from completely. But if we acknowledge that fear exists and that it's holding us back, then we can step past it. Elisa, I totally agree. She comments in the chat, it seems we need to let go of our egos. Yes, let go of our egos, maybe give ourselves permission to be wrong about something every once in a while, definitely. We can also be frank about criteria and considerations when we're in collaboration. Since we're examining everyone's assumptions, our own and our partners and stakeholders, that means we can list those out. I can say, here is what I have assumed and how I'm operating based on that. It puts it out in the light and they can respond and let me know if any of my assumptions are incorrect or run counter to theirs. I can ask open questions about what are the criteria that you're operating under. If we're in an experimentation or research phase, this also allows us to, and I do want to acknowledge there's a good question in the chat about navigating this mindset in a group setting. I see the question. I think I'm going to leave it till the Q&A section at the end so that we have a little more time to sort of get into the nuance of that and talk a bit about it. But Rupa, if you don't mind noting that one for the end so we can make sure we get back to it.
Yeah.
So if we're in the experimentation or research phase, we can do some things like test earlier. Now that we know we don't know what we think we know, we can get out there and get evidence to prove ourselves wrong or right. We could be willing to experiment live. Like the Jerry McGovern quote, you've got to get things out in the ecosystem to learn. The digital environment isn't going to sit still while you come up with a perfect answer and then try and implement it. You have to be willing to get things out there and see how they are actually happening in the real world test environment. And we could try unconventional things. So if we're setting aside assumptions and we're ready to wade into the unknown to make discoveries, as Martin Schwartz puts it, then we have to be willing to set aside some of these sort of preconceived notions that we have of what is the wrong and right way to do things, and be willing to try new things or unconventional things, different approaches. Those are sort of the three areas or phases of projects generally that I found this mindset to be really useful. But there's still a few practical applications that I want to touch on for this. I wanted to give you all some specific ideas that you could take away that would still apply broadly. And I think a good way to do that is in questions. For one thing, we're learning to empower ourselves to ask unconventional and stupid questions for good reasons. And for another thing, a lot of us use questions as part of our tool set when we're approaching a project or a problem. Those might be questions that you ask yourself to understand how to structure something and how it might work. Those might be questions that you're asking partners to understand what they're trying to get at, or to provoke them to think about something in a different way. There are also some unspoken fear-based questions that we tend to grapple with when we're dealing with something weighty. I think it's good to articulate those out loud, because then we can answer ourselves. So I've got a few examples of ways that you might either take a question that you're familiar with and reframe it in a new way that might be more helpful, or at least ask these questions in addition to your existing set, so you have something more robust. So the first example is, am I solving for every variable? This is something I've touched on earlier in the talk. We're dealing with really complex systems. We're dealing with understanding how the changes that we make are going to have ripple effects throughout those systems. And a lot of times we're dealing with a wide variety of stakeholders across a bunch of disciplines that are always bringing up, sometimes at the last minute, some new unknown that we have to account for. So I think a way that could be valuable to rephrase this question is, what are the variables that are critical to solve for? This helps us focus on what's importantly wrong with our model or with our proposal or with our solution. It also puts definite boundaries around what we're working on. So instead of having one of those never-ending projects that's constantly evolving to account for new variables and doesn't get launched into the ecosystem, we can tighten this down to focus on the actual necessity of this particular piece of work and set boundaries around it so that we can get that out in the ecosystem and start getting feedback on it. Another question, how do I convince partners this is right? This is something that I hear asked, or that I ask myself fairly often. If we're sitting and thinking that we have to come up with the perfect solution for something, and then we have these myriad stakeholders and partners that we have to get on board before that can go live, and all the dependencies associated with that, it gets pretty intimidating. You've got something that you've worked on that you hope is just right, and then you have to get everybody on your side. I think a better question is, am I ready to invite questions and challenges? This comes back a little bit to what I said earlier about being able to share earlier and more broadly in a collaboration stage. If we're thinking, I have to have the perfect solution totally defined, and then I've got to persuade everybody it's right, that's a very different mindset from thinking, I've started working on something and I think it has value. I'm ready now to invite questions and challenges to find out, is there anything I'm importantly wrong about? Are there any tigers in here? Are they just mice? And if it's not working, we're going to get insights about that. I would advise, where necessary, you might start small. So instead of sharing this with everybody on a giant email thread or in a team presentation, you might start with a trusted colleague that has a perspective that is aligned with yours in some respects, but a colleague that's also willing to challenge you on stuff. And that can help you find some of those big tigers before you start inviting questions and challenges from a bigger audience. What if this isn't ready, or what if I'm not ready? This is one that I see a lot, particularly when working with partners and trying to get something out the door or out to testing. And I have a two-parter question that I'd like to reframe it into. What will be gained by waiting if we don't think it's ready? And what might be lost by waiting? This gives me a big insight into whether it's time to move ahead with something and there's just fear and indecision that's been holding that process back, or whether there's really some value in waiting and continuing to work on something if we can weigh these two things against each other. And I found it works really well to pose with partners as well. Again, that might be a trusted teammate that understands your work. In a larger group setting, this is definitely a productively stupid question. If everyone's saying, no, we need to wait because, reframing it in this light forces everybody for a good cause to state the assumptions that they're making, which we're all about. Okay. Another question that I think is particularly useful for conversations with partners, especially in a research or experimentation phase, I think the common question is, what if it fails? What if it doesn't work? And I think a much better question to ask is, what would failure teach us? So if we're coming here with a mindset of being stupid for the right reason, and for not just trying to confirm our totally brilliant and flawless ideas, then we can ask the important questions to our users and customers and be ready to be wrong. A lot of times finding out that something does not work is just as instructive or more instructive than finding out when something does. So when you're presented with a scenario, I think particularly with partners, where they're saying, well, we shouldn't launch it yet, we shouldn't experiment yet, we shouldn't research yet because it might not work, then having this conversation and saying, what if we did and it didn't work? What would we learn from that? Can oftentimes be just as valuable. This one I'm actually going to dwell on for a minute because I think there's a lot of different ways this can potentially be reframed that are useful to us. So I'll throw up a few different examples. But this one is this foolproof and critique proof? In essence, is this thing perfect? One way that we might reframe this is saying, is this an improvement on what exists? So are we holding back on something that could make a positive change in the digital ecosystem or in processes and infrastructure because we don't believe that it's a big enough change? Instead of feeling like something has to be exactly right, ask, is it better than what exists now? And it could harken back to the previous question about what is gained by waiting versus what is lost by waiting. If we're waiting another year, 5 years, 2 months, whatever the time period is to come up with something that's foolproof, critique-proof, perfect, and we're missing out on that time where we could have incrementally improved the experience, then maybe that cost and benefit isn't actually worth it. We could also reframe this question if we're thinking about a model, a map, a taxonomy, a wireframe, and say, is this accurate? So instead of, is this thing perfect, say, is this accurate? Those types of things where we're looking at the state of something that exists and trying to present it, the entire purpose of that is for instruction and collaboration. So it doesn't have to look beautiful. It doesn't have to be exactly right. If it accurately as possible, represents the thing that we need to understand, that's already better than perfect. We could reframe this as well and say, instead of, is this perfect, say, is this useful? I can't tell you the number of times that I've shared something that I thought was not that important or would only be useful to me, and seen light bulbs turn on for the person that I shared it with. Something does not have to be perfect to be useful. And generally, you're not going to know whether or not it's useful until you use it, which means sharing it. If it's useful, it's doing its job. And if it's not, that gives you insight into what's importantly wrong and what needs to change. This comes back again to the idea of sharing earlier and more often. Am I ready to see whether or not this thing works? It's not going to start working until you get that kind of input on it. And finally, one question that is a little more personally pointed. What if I mess this up? I think this is a sort of an invisible or unspoken chorus that might run through our heads, particularly when we're tackling something that is new to us or that we hold a lot of value for. Again, we care about our work and we want to get it right because it is important, because we're good at it, because we love what we do. When we're faced with that sort of big challenge and we're thinking, maybe I shouldn't do it because I might mess it up, I think it's helpful to flip the script and ask ourselves, what if I didn't mess it up? What if I do a fantastic job? What would happen then? Or we could pair these questions together and instead of just saying, what if I mess this up and then leaving it there because we don't want to think about it, we could ask, what would happen if I mess this up? Like, if I'm scared about this presentation or I'm worried about this pitch to a client, what is the worst case scenario? Am I going to get fired on the spot? Probably not. What is the more likely scenario? I'm probably going to do a pretty good job. Maybe the scenario is I don't do the best job ever because I haven't really pitched before. Then I have learned something that I can take into the next time. So I think these two questions, either flipping it to say, what if this went well, or pairing them together can be really useful. There's a comment in the chat about having an idea diary or a journal to list ideas and their feedback, something to work on then. I think that's great. I sometimes keep in a document, like a sticky note on my computer, sort of feedback themes that I see happening. So when I'm looking at something, I can say, oh yes, X, Y, and Z are sort of questions that I commonly get when I'm sharing something. Have I thought through those yet? Not because I don't still want that feedback, but it can be sort of like having like an invisible friend, I guess, that lists out just some of those common things so you can work through them and then get to the next set of tigers when you're talking to a live person. Okay. We've talked about chasing flawlessness and how that can put us in the wrong mindset or potentially lead us to make decisions or avoid making decisions out of fear. We've talked about being stupid on purpose so that we can build functional solutions instead. And before we jump to the Q&A bit, I want to summarize just a couple of main thoughts. If you're wrong, you're free. And that means that you can figure out where you are importantly wrong about something. It also means you can be emboldened to ask important questions, or I think I said earlier, the stupider the question, the better. Feel free to make your desktop wallpaper say that if you'd like. And architecture will never be perfect. Systems will never be perfect. Designs will never be perfect. It's going to be a living, changing entity because we work in digital. And failures can be just as useful as successes. So we need to get things out into that living, breathing entity. And we don't have to worry about succeeding all the time because a failure can be just as useful. I think the way that I would sum up the idea is be enthusiastically flawed, and then you can be enthusiastically functional in what you're building.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Jael. And the takeaway is, if you are wrong, you are free, right?
Exactly. Thank you for hosting, Rupa.
Oh, very welcome. I would love to invite you once again. Another talk and similar topic. I think this would be wonderful. This would be wonderful once again.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining.